Chapter 4. Mopple Squeezes Through a Gap. There was no wind the next day, and the gulls were not calling. Thick gray mist crawled back and forth over the meadow. No one could see more than 2 sheep's lengths ahead. For a long time they stayed in the hay barn, where it was warm and comfortable. Now that Tess and George weren't driving them out into the early morning light anymore, they were choosier. "It's damp," said Maud. "It's cold," said Sarah. "It's too much to expect of us," said Sir Richfield. That settled the matter. The old ram hated mist. Richfield couldn't use his good eyes at all in mist. He realized that he wasn't hearing very well these days, and he very soon forgot which way he had come. But there was another reason for the general hesitation, too. The mist seemed to them sinister today, as if strange shadows were moving beyond its white breath. So they stayed in the barn all morning. They got bored, they felt guilty, and finally they were hungry. But they remembered how George and Tess had annoyed them on days like this, and stayed put. A front line of white, thoughtful sheep's faces stared short-sightedly into the swaths of mist, while Mopple started forcing his way out into the open air through a gap in the back wall of the barn. The wooden splinters of the rotten planks caught in his fleece and scratched his tender skin. When he had squeezed himself about halfway through, he began to wonder whether his idea about the gap had really been a good one. "If the head will fit through, so will the rest of the body," George always used to say. Only now did it strike Mopple that he had been talking about the rats in the shepherd's caravan, feasting on the contents of rusty cans. Mopple had never seen a rat at close quarters. He wasn't so sure whether they really did look like small sheep. Mopple's mother had told him so when he was still a plump suckling lamb. She said that they were very small and very woolly sheep who ran through the stables and barns in flocks, taking dreams to the big sheep. As a grown ram, he had wondered why other sheep kicked out at those little rat sheep. He concluded that they were probably sheep having bad dreams. Mopple couldn't complain of his own dreams. There wasn't much variety in them, but they were peaceful. Mopple stopped to think about what most sheep looked like. Zora, for instance. Elegant nose and velvety black face, gracefully curved horns. Zora was the only ewe with horns in George's flock, and they suited her extremely well. Large, fleecy body, and 4 long, straight legs with delicate feet. The head might be a sheep's most attractive feature, but it wasn't the widest part of its body. Mopple twisted and turned uncomfortably, determined not to panic, at least not straight away. Was it right to go out through a gap in secret, behind the backs of the other sheep? He had his reasons, but were they good reasons? For one thing, he felt hungry sooner and more often than the others. Not a bad reason. Mopple stretched his neck, got a tuft of grass between his teeth, and calmed down a bit. The other reason was more complicated. The other reason was Sir Richfield, or Mopple's own memory, or Miss Maple, or rather, all 3 of them together. A clue. There had been a great many clues in George's detective story, but George had thrown the book away. However, Miss Maple would know what to do with a clue, and Richfield would probably try to prevent Mopple from telling Maple. So, Mopple had to get through this gap, to tell Miss Maple in secret. She wasn't in the hay barn, so she must be outside somewhere. Or maybe not. Before Mopple started, it had all seemed very simple, but now a sharp splinter of wood was sticking into his side, and he was terrified of puncturing himself and leaking out like Sir Richfield. The sheep all agreed that somewhere in Sir Richfield there must be a hole through which his memories leaked out and trickled away, but they ventured to say so only when he wasn't within hearing distance. These days it wasn't difficult to be out of hearing distance of Sir Richfield. Mopple tried to make himself thinner. The sharp stabbing feeling went away. He took a deep breath, and the tip of the splinter stuck into his side again. Panic was very close now. He felt it breathing down his neck like a beast of prey. He was going to leak worse than Sir Richfield. He'd forget everything, even why he was in this gap. And then he'd be stuck here forever and die of starvation. Starvation! Him, Mopple the whale! Mopple made himself so thin that he saw stars in front of his eyes and kicked out frantically with his back legs. Othello had spent half the night out in the meadow, dripping wet and in a state of feverish excitement. Would he come back? From the moment when Othello saw Sir Richfield, he had secretly hoped so. He had feared it, too. Now it had happened. The memory of a scent still lingered in Othello's nostrils. Ideas circled around his horns like swirling mist. Joy, anger, fury, 1,000 questions, and a tingling sense of embarrassment. But Othello had learned to drive the swirling thoughts in his head away. Through the damp mist, he scented the air in the direction of the hay barn, nervous sweat and a sour smell of bewilderment. The flock was in the grip of disquiet, and rightly so. Even Othello felt there was something eerie about the mist today. Richfield still wasn't letting his sheep out of the dry barn. All the better, but Othello wondered what the lead ram hoped to gain by it. Did Richfield know who had come to their meadow last night? Was he trying to conceal the fact from the other sheep? If so, why? The black ram briefly wondered which way to go. The least likely way, of course. He trotted towards the cliffs. Last night's rain and the misty air had washed away all the scents. Othello put his head on one side and used his eyes to look for tracks, the way a human would. He felt slightly ashamed of that. Almost deaf, almost no sense of smell. He heard the familiar and always slightly mocking voice say inside his head, a voice from memory, accompanied by the rushing of black crow's wings. If you want to know what the two legs know, you have to stop and think what they don't know. All that matters to them is what they can see with their eyes. They don't know more than we do. They know less. That's why it's so difficult to understand them. But Othello shook his head to drive the voice away. Good advice, no doubt about it, but the voice often said confusing things, and now he had to concentrate. In one place, the ground was not just soggy, but positively churned up. By Miss Maple, probably. He would never have left a mess like that behind. Othello was looking for something less conspicuous. A little further off, he saw a stunted pine tree, the only pine growing anywhere far and wide. Friendly evergreens, keepers of secrets, wise roots. The pine tree attracted Othello. He circled round the small tree until it seemed to lean over in shame before his eyes. Nothing unusual, except for the hole, of course, but Othello didn't think much of the stories about the hole. The hole was right beside the roots of the pine and went down through the rock at an angle. Day and night, the sound of the sea came through it, gurgling and glugging, mocking laughter from the depths. It was said that at full moon, sea creatures came up through the hole to run their slimy fingers round the hay barn. But Othello knew that the shimmering lines you saw on the wooden walls of the barn, when morning came, were really slimy trails left by slugs. The other sheep knew it too in their hearts. They just liked stories. On some days, you could see 3 or 4 particularly bold young sheep assembled under the pine tree, listening to the sounds in the hole and giving themselves an enjoyable fright. Now Othello looked down there too. Steep, certainly, but not too steep for a human who could use his hands, and not too steep for a brave sheep. Othello hesitated. Something that tastes bad the first time you chew it won't taste any better the 10th time, mocked the voice. Waiting feeds your fear, it then added impatiently, as the ram still didn't move. But Othello wasn't listening to the voice. He was staring spellbound at something dark and shining at his feet, a shimmering feather, black and still as night. Othello snorted. He turned his head in the direction of the hay barn once more and then disappeared down the hole. Mopple was out in the open air, breathing heavily and trembling. His sides felt sore, and there was a sharp stabbing pain in one place. To calm himself down, he repeated the most difficult phrase he had ever learned. Operation Polyphemus. George sometimes used to say it, and no sheep ever understood him. Mopple was one of the few sheep who could remember things he didn't even understand. After saying it, he felt braver. Mopple turned his head to look, not without pride, at the narrow gap through which he, Mopple the whale, had just squeezed his way. But the wooden wall of the hay barn had already disappeared in a mist so dense and solid that Mopple felt almost tempted to take a bite of it. He controlled himself and pulled up some grass instead. The mist wasn't a problem to Mopple. You didn't see as well in mist, that was true, but when Mopple saw poorly anyways, he was more bothered by the fact that you couldn't pick up a scent properly if you had a cool, grassy water drops inside your nostrils. But in general, he felt safe in the mist, as if he were walking through the fleece of a gigantic sheep, fleece as light as a feather. Unperturbed, he went on grazing. Now he was sure that at least his first reason for getting out had been a good one. Mopple loved misty grass, clear tasting as water, with all disturbing smells washed off it. He could look for Miss Maple later, and perhaps she'd be attracted over here by his grass-munching sounds anyway. He wandered back and forth at a trotting pace until he didn't feel quite so hungry. Suddenly, his nose came up against something hard and cold. Mopple jumped back in alarm with all 4 feet in the air at once. From where he was now, however, he couldn't see what had frightened him. He hesitated. Curiosity won the day. He stepped forward and looked at the ground. There lay the spade, around which Tom O'Malley had assembled the human flock. It had been driven into the ground deep enough. It had leaned to one side and finally fallen over. Mopple looked crossly at the spade. Human tools belonged in tool sheds and not in the meadow. But this spade didn't smell at all the way human tools usually smell, of sweating hands, annoyance, and sharp things. There was only a faint memory of human scent left around this spade. Apart from that, it smelled as smooth and clean as a wet pebble. But if you tried hard enough to pick up that human scent, you found the memory slowly gaining a more distinct structure. Soapy water, whiskey, and vinegary cleaning fluid were all part of it. Mopple scented a short, rancid beard and unwashed feet. Almost too late, he realized that it wasn't the spade he was smelling now, but a real human being moving through the mist right beside him. He raised his head and saw a figure, the white, misty shadow of a figure, moving sideways in his direction, like a crab. He lost his nerve and galloped away through the mist. Running through mist is not a very clever thing to do. Mopple the whale knew that, but he also knew he couldn't just stand still. His legs, which normally carried him unerringly toward wild herbs and fragrant carpets of grass, suddenly had ideas of their own. All the mist in the world seemed to have gathered inside Mopple's head, and he would have liked simply to forget it. He would have liked to be all legs, running away from everything. George, the wolf's ghost, Miss Maple, fierce dogs, Sir Richfield, his memory, and above all, death. But One of his hooves was hurting from the unusual force with which his legs were hammering down on the ground. He tried thinking of something, anything, and promptly the most unpleasant thought of all occurred to him. The thought of what was bound to happen any minute. Sooner or later he would come up against an obstacle. That obstacle could be the cliffs, or the hay barn, or George's caravan. Please not the caravan, thought Mopple. The idea of meeting a furious, ghostly George waving a nibbled lettuce stalk in the vegetable garden, the scene of Mopple's crime, scared him most of all. Mopple the whale bumped into something large and soft and warm. It gave way and toppled forward with a grunt. The smell was penetrating, and even before Mopple had finished investigating it, his legs went weak with fear. He sat on his haunches and peered through the mist with eyes wide open. The grunt turned into a curse, words that Mopple had never heard before in his life, yet which he understood at once. Then the butcher emerged from the mist, first his huge red hands, then his rounded paunch, and finally his terrible, glittering eyes. They were looking at Mopple without haste. Indeed, they even seemed to be pleased with something. Without warning, the butcher flung himself on Mopple, as if to crush him with the sheer mass of his own flesh. The next thing Mopple knew was that he must have managed to dodge him not just once, but several times. The butcher had repeatedly fallen in the mud. His elbows, belly, knees, and half his face were black with it. A few green blades of grass were sticking to his left cheek like whiskers. And through Mopple's short-sighted eyes, the butcher looked like a very vicious, fat tiger cat. The parts of his face that weren't black with mud, especially his forehead and eye sockets, were red as a sheep's sore tongue. His neck was red too, and curiously thick and swollen. Mopple was trembling all over, exhausted. In the silence that followed, the butcher saw that Mopple was finished. One of his hands clenched into an enormous fist and slammed into the other half-opened hand. Then the outer hand closed around the inner hand. It was as if the butcher's arms were growing together into a ball of raw meat. The knuckles turned white, and Mopple heard a faint, nasty noise, a distant cracking, as if a bone were being slowly broken. The ram stared helplessly at the butcher, automatically chewing the last tuft of grass that he had pulled up in distant, happier times. It tasted of nothing. Mopple couldn't remember why he had been grazing. He no longer knew why any sheep in the world would want to graze as long as there were butchers around. The butcher took a small step backwards. Then, all of a sudden, it was as if the ground had swallowed him up. Mopple stood there chewing. He chewed until there wasn't a single fiber of grass left in his mouth. As long as he chewed, nothing would happen. He felt silly, chewing with his mouth empty, but he dared not pull up another tuft of grass. A few wisps of mist drifted past, and then, suddenly, there was a patch of clear air, a window, and Mopple could look through it. But he saw nothing. Mopple was standing on the edge of the abyss. He didn't wonder where the butcher had gone anymore. He took a careful step backwards, then another. Then Mopple the whale turned and let the mist swallow him up again. Up till now, Mopple had always liked the mist. When he was still a lamb, the shepherd had stopped him suckling from his mother one day. "He's getting fat too quickly," said the shepherd. From then on, the shepherd himself suckled from Mopple's mother, using some kind of implement. The shepherd was fat too, but no sheep could stop him doing anything. Mopple was given mixed milk and water to drink. He enjoyed watching the milk and water mingle. The white milk span threads in the water until a dense and delicate web had formed. That web was like the mist, getting thicker and thicker, and it was a promise that Mopple would have a full stomach and everything was all right. But today, Mopple had found out that mist wasn't the fleece of a gigantic sheep after all. Or if it was, then that sheep was infested by vermin, butchers with hands made of raw meat that turned everything they touched into raw meat too. Slowly, he began to wonder about the dreadful yells rising from the depths. They were yells that Mopple could feel right to the tips of his spiral horns. They hurt him in his teeth and his hooves, and he didn't try to run away from them. He knew now that you couldn't simply run away like that, not even to the other sheep, who were only a kind of mist themselves, and could just as quickly dissolve into nothing. He'd seen sheep disappear before, all his foster brothers, his suckling companions, his friends when they were milk-fed lambs, and only the shepherd had ever come back, fat and cold. Mopple looked at the ground and saw the grass, which was still as green as before. Perhaps he should hang on to the grass. Without taking his eyes off the ground, Mopple began to move. Carefully, he put one hoof in front of another, following the grass wherever it might take him. Othello was annoyed with himself. The hole had not been a problem. Easy once you entrusted yourself to it. That was just like him. Your problems aren't in your feet or your eyes or your mouth. Your problems are always in your head, whispered the voice. Now Othello was sifting through his head as carefully as only a sheep chewing the cud can. He had already trotted some way along the beach without picking up any tracks at all. The sand moved beneath his feet, pleasantly soft, but sly and sluggish too. And now there was that yelling into the bargain. It wasn't close enough to threaten Othello, but it was loud and nerve-wracking. Who or what in the world could be yelling like that? The question interested him. In any other circumstances, he would probably have turned round to take a look at the source of the yells, but what might lie ahead of him interested him more. He must be quite close to the village now. Othello knew it was time to get off the beach. The ram looked up at the cliffs. They were less steep here, and soft and sandy in many places. Coarse seagrass grew where the wind had heaped the sand up into small dunes. It wasn't worth much as grazing, but it offered a good foothold. Othello climbed the slope. Once at the top, he saw more of the bristly seagrass and a narrow human footpath winding its pointless way through the dust. The seagrass stretched monotonously in all directions and told him nothing. If you don't know what to do, you must either give up or let it alone, mocked the voice. It comes to the same thing. Othello stood where he was. There were a number of paths a sheep could have taken here, but there was only one path that you could be sure no sheep would ever have chosen. Well, almost no sheep. Othello went on along the human footpath towards the village. The path wound undecidedly this way and that a few times, and then he found a dry stone wall and walked straight as a sheep's leg along beside it. The wall was so high that even if Othello got up on his hind legs, he couldn't see over it. That was a pity, because peculiar things were happening on the other side of the wall. Many voices were murmuring in a low, quiet tone, and it wasn't just the mist muting them. Othello felt that they were excited, but had been made to hush. It was seldom that humans took the trouble to be quiet. It always meant something. Othello came to a small wrought iron gate. He pushed the latch down with one of his front hooves, and the gate gave way with a squeal. The black ram slipped through it as silently as his own shadow, and pushed the gate shut again with his head. Not for the first time, he was glad of those terrible times with the circus. Othello thought he had arrived in a huge vegetable garden. It was so tidy that it looked like a garden, straight paths and square beds, and the smell of freshly turned earth and unnatural vegetation. Something must have been planted here, only it didn't really smell appetizing. Human forms were moving along the paths, taking small steps. They seemed to be coming from all over the place, but they were magically attracted to one point. Othello hid behind a stone that was standing on end. He felt uneasy, and not just because of the human beings. It was the smell. Othello now knew for certain that he wasn't in a vegetable garden. It might even be the opposite of a vegetable garden. A very old smell drifted with the mist along the gravel paths. Othello thought of Sam. Sam was a man who had worked at the zoo, and he was so stupid that even the goats made fun of him. But the zoo management had put Sam in charge of the pit which lay in the no man's land behind the elephant house. Even as a lamb, Othello could understand why the elephant's eyelids always drooped and looked so red and heavy. Every animal in the zoo knew about the pit. When Sam came back from it, the goats left him alone, and the eyes of the carrion eaters narrowed. When Sam came back from the pit, he smelled of ancient death. It was the first time Othello had been to a funeral, but the ram behaved beautifully. Black and serious, he stood among the gravestones, munching a pansy now and then, and listening attentively to the music. He saw the brown box roll up and immediately knew by the scent who was inside. Even before he emerged from the mist, he scented God swaying solemnly. God talked about himself, and Fat Kate cried. Nobody seemed to be thinking of George inside the box, except Othello. Othello remembered when he had first seen George through a great deal of cigarette smoke. Blood was trickling into his eyes. He was so exhausted that his legs were trembling. The dog beside him was dead, but that didn't mean much. There would always be another dog. Othello concentrated on staying on his feet and keeping his eyes open. It was difficult, too difficult. He just wanted to blink the blood out of his eyes, but once he had closed them, they stayed closed. A few moments of heavenly blackness, and then the voice spoke up, rather late in the day. Closed eyes mean death, it said. Othello had no objection to being dead. All the same, he obediently forced his eyelids open and looked straight into George's green eyes. George stared at him with so much interest that Othello managed to hold on to his gaze until his legs weren't trembling so much. Then he turned to the door that the dogs came through and lowered his horns. A little later, he was lying in George's old car, bleeding all over the back seat. George was sitting in the driver's seat, but the car was stationary, and night pressed against the windows. The old shepherd had turned to him with triumph in his eyes. We're going to Europe, he announced. George had been wrong, though. They never had gone to Europe. Justice, thought Othello. Justice.